First of all, I would like to ask you if you can tell us a little bit about the research projects you are involved right now. Sort of give us an overview of your research agenda at this point.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm actually about to end a huge multidisciplinary research which has been going on for 7 or 8 years, in which we have tried to figure out various ways of becoming politically engaged and civically engaged. A group of developmental psychologists and political scientists and media and communication scientists. So we have followed 5 cohorts over 6 years. And trying to see what they do and how they think in their everyday life context of school, of home, and internet and associations. And we have been eager to try to understand their various trajectories. That has been very, very fascinating project, I must say. Probably the most demanding and the most thrilling project so far. The second project I'm involved in currently deals with how young European citizens relate to the European project and the European Union. We collaborate also psychologists and sociologists and educational scientists and political scientists covering 8 EU member states from Portugal, Greece, Czech, Slovenia, Lithuania and England and Sweden to see how people understand Europe and their feelings and their knowledge and their goals. And in that project we also install an experimental design or an intervention design actually in the schools. To see if special attention to European issues can enhance their interest and engagement in European affairs. And the third one is also in the wider European setting. We are comparing how Italian and Swedish young people organize and think about illegal actions. And we also compare their parents with each other, and comparing due to the fact that Italy and Sweden have very, very diverse histories of illegal action and democratic development, as you know. So these are the 3 most active projects I'm involved in right now.
Now, one thing, speaking of civic engagement, one of the things that you talk about, and it's also you talk about those things based on what's sort of popular concern or worries, is on the one hand the civic disengagement of young people, and on the other hand what could be the extreme behavior of some groups that will be too engaged and will threaten the system. And
exactly.
So what can you tell us about that sort of balance that needs to be created, particularly for the implications of socialization in terms of engagement and stability?
Yeah, I think we can criticize ourselves in our various disciplinary traditions for being too naive about civic engagement and political participation. We almost have taken for granted that it should be about good things, about civic virtues and things that we are proud of, public concern, peaceful means and good ends and all this good stuff. So for 10 years ago we talked in that way about civic engagement, and we were worried, and politicians and others were worried about the low levels of civic engagement. But then all of a sudden people have here and there in Europe and elsewhere became very engaged, and they started to engage, but in a way and for purposes that we may be critical against. They have used illegal means, they have destroyed properties, they have threatened lives, and they have also been around very anti-democratic ideas, very xenophobic, many also Islamophobic ideas have gathered so many people. So the lesson I think we can learn is that we have to be very open-minded, and we had to attach also the ends and the content of the actions when we are talking about civic engagement and political participation, before we can love it or adore it or support and promote it. So I think political socialization research have to ask more about what are you civically engaged in, about and for. And that one lesson we are learning now in Europe, where we see such an increase of civic engagement, but for ends and for purposes we are very scared of, for good reasons.
In a group that I was one time at a conference, and there was debate about what was worse, disengagement or the wrong kind of engagement, and in a way that alludes to what you are talking, right? Yeah. Now, another thing that relates to that, and I think you've been involved in research in that area, is migration, and how migration at the same time can push a society to expand, to grow, but at the same time challenge the system in terms of the traditions and the way the system works. So what have you learned about those kind of issues through your research?
What we have learned, among other things, is that the civic culture of Sweden and Scandinavia has been well known for having a very high degree of tolerance. And this has been the case for decades after decades, and it has been the case for older people and young people alike. Almost no differences in these respects. But since we have welcomed so many foreign people due to our immigration and refugee policies, our tolerance has been put to a test. Now, for the first time in history, we really have to live with people not looking like ourselves, not believing that we used to do, and not behaving in the way we used to do. Religion, for instance, has been very, very visible in the public space after have been away for many, many decades. So I think that one thing we can learn is to be more nuanced in the ways we're asking about tolerance, to specify very clearly what the tolerance should be about. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, in the general talk about tolerance, I don't think it's clever to just speak in favor of tolerance, because we have to realize what Karl Popper and other social scientists early remind us about, namely that we cannot tolerate intolerant people, and we cannot tolerate ideas that are intolerant. So our tolerance must have specific borders, and I think we have to be aware of that to a greater extent than we actually have been. The third thing I think we have learned is that an influx of immigrants also create tensions in terms of social disorder, and most of all is exploited as a threat by those who have other reasons to exploit it, like the many populist political parties from the right wing that has emerged around Europe, in every Scandinavian country too. They have very successfully, also in elections, been organizing protests and mobilized around this issue about immigration.
Do you think explain the increase in popularity of the populist right-wing parties? Migration is one issue, but that is so because it is confronted with other social issues in the countries that receive the migrants, right?
Absolutely, and I think the other parties have totally underestimated the sentiments of some social groups in Sweden about fear and about feelings of unsafety and uncomfortness and all these things. So they have failed in the political pedagogical project to argue and to explain and to motivate. They have taken for granted that their decisions do have a degree of being legitimate, which has traditionally been the case, but which now has been questioned by the populist parties.
Mm.
So the populist parties have been very successful in listening or claiming that they are listening to these other sentiments. So their success can be explained in two various ways. In other words, the first one is that they organize and mobilize anti-immigrant feelings, but they also mobilize to a high extent feelings about that politicians do not listen to people like me. So immigration policy has been seen as a huge elite project by those in Stockholm, our capital, are making, ignoring questions and feelings, and so around in the Swedish countryside.
Is it true that the success of the populist parties, particularly right-wing populist parties, it's more so with people that feel alienated?
Absolutely.
By the system?
Yes. What we are about to finalize is a study showing that those who feel most forgotten and most not listened to in society as well as at homes, those are the ones that are most attracted by right-wing populist parties' ideas, which is a tragedy, of course, and which is a very hard lesson to learn by the other political parties. So I think there is a positive and tough message to send to the other very stable political parties, that they shouldn't forget to be in dialogue with various groups of people. They couldn't take their support for granted. So now in Sweden, the populist party we are talking about, without naming it, but their name is Sverigedemokraterna, Sweden Democrats. They are in the last polls given the second largest position among the political parties after the Social Democrats. So it's a big change on the political landscape in Sweden.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that it's kind of interesting to me, you also talk about different kinds of civic engagement, and actually there's one group that you describe, which is the bystanders, right?
The stand-byers.
The stand-byers. the stand-buyers, which are not really, they are people that are sort of latent citizens in terms of the possibility of really acting, but they are not very active. So how would you describe and how would you define the different groups that you have identified in your studies in terms of civic engagement?
Yeah, the stand-buyers are the most knowledgeable. They are the most politically efficacious group, and they have the strongest social capital, and they have the highest goal for their future political involvement and civic involvement of them all. But they also are the most trusting among the groups. And it is probably the last factor that explains why they stand by. Because they trust in the political parties, in the political institutions to run the political businesses in the normal day of life, so to say. But they are willing to and they are prepared to step in if the politicians are making any silly and provoking decisions, if certain values are threatened, or if specific opportunities are open to step in and climb in and making their participation more manifest. But they are a latent group of a civic reserve. But as long as everything works, they prefer to do other things, except for that they really have a look on what's going on. But the dangerous thing with the group is that they are very dependent on media coverage. So if the media won't report scandals or threatening decisions, so they will stay by, so to say. I think it's a risk, since the media may miss, for instance, the emergence of the new right-wing political party. It was very late during the day before the media started to see what's going on in Sweden.
Is it possible too that there is a group of stand-buyers that feel threatened about nationalistic issues, particularly when it comes with migration, and they are mobilized because they feel like these migrants or the way the country is going, it threatens the national values of Sweden or any?
Absolutely. But I won't include them in the stand-buyers.
You wouldn't?
No.
Okay.
No, I would like to keep stand-buyers as a very distinct group, since they are so trusting and they have so good and high democratic standards.
Okay.
And they have such a high level of tolerance and all these things that I think are good. While the alienated people, they get attracted and recruited by the right-wing populists despite of or due to their low level of trust. Okay.
So they only share the characteristic of being latent with the stand-buyers, but
that's correct.
But not really the other characteristics.
No.
So that's an important distinction.
Absolutely.
Now I would like to ask you a couple of sort of basic questions because I think it's interesting to hear your perspective when you talk about political efficacy or even engagement, civic engagement. There are different ways to look at civic engagement, and there are different ways to think about, maybe not so many, but there are some of political efficacy. So I would like to ask you for your point of view about, for example, those two concepts.
I think research has been a little bit unprecise in early research and forgot to distinguish between civic engagement and political participation. Civic engagement to me is about the social involvement going on in a, so to say, horizontal dimension of society. When you connect people with people individually or collectively, you are sharing journeys, so to say. You are supporting each other, helping, listening, organizing, and setting up soup kitchens and helping poorer people, and lots of things such as volunteering. And this is when you do things, you are not immediately or surely benefiting from yourself. It's sort of altruistic behavior. In contrast, political participation deals with this dimension. It connects you with the political decision making taking place at various levels of the political system, and dealing with scarce resources, conflicts that must be solved, votings, standpoints of more or less controversial kind. And it's about conflicts. It's a high risk involvement in contrast to the social engagement, which not always, or maybe even very seldom, has that conflictual dimension. So many people, also in Sweden, when we're asking them about political interest, say, no, I'm not interested, because they try in their everyday life also to avoid things that make them to enemies in other people's eyes. So political is very much loaded with party political, even if it could be more positive than I've understood that it's the case in Chile, where party politics per definition is a dirty business with extremely low trust and trustworthiness in the eyes of the people. So to me this distinction has been very, very important. But I argue also that civic engagement can be the sort of what you call when babies are cuveuses. Did you have the Spanish expression? Where babies immediately when they have been born can need some special container to stay in before they are set free. So to say. What do you have it?
Is the
they are fed with gas and.
Oh yeah, it's let me try to remember the word. It's incubadora.
Incubadora. See?
Okay.
So civic engagement can be the incubadora for political participation for some. So it can be the giver. You're asking about political efficacy. And political efficacy is shown also decades after decades to be very, very important, but to consist of two different dimensions. The internal political efficacy deals with whether I think that I'm capable of making a change. If I can master various skills and various actions or not. If I would be able to write a letter to the editor or arrange a list of signing up for other people in protest to a decision about closing a school or a hospital or whatever it can be. While the external dimension is about whether someone is listening to me, if there is a responsiveness from the system to me. So it's more about the quality of listening, as we were talking about before regarding the Populist Party, which is very, very successful in claiming that they are responsive to people like you. But these are very, very central concepts, and they have such a huge explanatory value, power.
Right. Now that you are talking about being listened to and voice, you make a parallel between, in your research, between the feeling of being voiceless at home and being voiceless at as a civic or citizen. So there is sort of a parallel in those two realms, and that seems to be really one seems to be really predictive of the other.
Yes, exactly. And maybe the fascination I feel tells you more about my own limited political science understanding of feelings. In any case, we in the research project we've been very convinced that politics cannot be understood without including feelings, and we have a wonderful scale in our project, in our code book, about what feelings you have for politics, and it always operates so nicely when we are about to explain activity or passivity, for instance. So politics has to do not only with knowledge and skills and attitudes and so, but also with feelings of fun, of excitement, of attraction, of meaningfulness, and powerlessness and so.
The other issue that I think it's really interesting, since we are speaking about the feeling of being heard or listened to, is what are the implications of this research for political and civic socialization, particularly of young people?
Can you give me a more?
Sure. I mean,
precise?
Some of the examples that we've been talking about, for example, the issue of feeling that you don't have a voice, for example, at home, and that may translate also to not feeling heard socially, implies certain sort of structural conditions.
Sure.
But also the schools play a role in terms of helping young people internalize certain values, and the schools in themselves are contexts where you should feel heard and listened to. So the ideas of the research you've done, how can you translate the voicelessness into practices of socialization that will help, in a way, because in a way it's sort of a paradoxical that you will teach someone, but there has to be some changes in order for them to be heard. So how can you sort of make those two things compatible?
It's a very, very difficult question to answer, but there are several lessons in these findings. One is a lesson for every parent to be learned, that how we behave at home, how we include our children and grandchildren in our family decision making seems to be very important, and correlates and coexists in a very, very logical way, a very strong way with how you are situated and how you are listened to in other contexts, such as the societal context. I think that also teachers could draw the conclusion of this and learn the lesson that as authorities, and teachers are not only adults, significant adults, they are also representative of the state, of the public order and the public authorities. So, and to many of the kids, these are the first persons they meet representing a wider public. So how the teachers treat their pupils and students, we can show in a longitudinal study is so important for their beliefs in democracy and their trust in government and their own political self-understanding and understanding of the democracies. So the more unfair ways teachers are treating the kids, the less the kids believe and trust the democratic institutions all over, which seems logic. I mean, they have reasons for not trusting them. But as you are indicating, schools are to handle a very delicate dilemma, because we want them to help the kids to develop the strong things of civic minds, attitudes, knowledge, and skills. But what do we do if the institutions are not worthy their civic engagement and political participation? So they have a difficult task, and I'm probably not the guy to tell them how to behave, other than they of course should remind the pupils and the students about that when they are talking about democracy, they are talking in a way about an ideal type of democracy where leaders are worthy of their trust. But they also have to inform about, I think, that the reality may deviate more or less from that ideal type situation. So it's tremendously difficult, and it's as important, of course, that they won't feed the disillusionment, the disillusion among the peoples. But
sure. Now, as a political scientist, you have sort of cross fields and work with other scholars, psychologists, sociologists, communication people, and you've made the point that in general political science scholars are not very interested in people underage for voting because they don't vote, and paradoxically the antecedents of voting behavior and civic engagement are probably in the early stages of life. So what are your suggestions for the field in general, particularly for political scientists in that respect?
Well, I can at least try to argue that they can start, say, 2 or 3 years earlier. Then they will get a more fascinating story about the young voter. They can understand the young voter, as we will give to the field a new understanding of why the first-time voter prefers the radical right-wing populist party instead of the others. I mean, we can only do it since we have started earlier. We started when they were 13 or at least 16, and then we can see what happens. So that's one argument, even if I don't believe in my capacity to argue and convincingly that they all may pay more attention. I mean, political socialization is such a low status field of political science. It was nearly proclaimed to be dead for some years. I think I bring to the field other things that they more easily can include in their own studies, such as the thing we were addressing here, namely affections and feelings. But we'll see what happens.
And speaking of we will see, what are your sort of expectations for where the field of civic and political engagement studies is moving in the future? What do you see as the main theoretical and methodological challenges to the field?
I think and I hope, and it's wishful thinking included, of course, that many people more and more gets the eye-opening experience of what you can show and learn by using longitudinal data, and the necessity nowadays to cooperate cross-disciplinary borders. I mean, we can just think for a minute about political communication, political talk. What discipline could convincingly argue that this is the field on which we have the monopoly? I mean, what we have experienced is that developmental psychology has so many things to add when it comes to climate, relationships within the family over the years. And the political communication also must be fed by ideas and methods and insights from media and communication sciences. And they need, hopefully, political scientists to understand such crucial concepts and political efficacy and political trust and so on. So I think it will be much more of multidisciplinary collaboration. And I see many examples of that among the young generation. And the other thing I see as very necessary and very, very promising is that we don't organize our researchers into two distinct and separated groups, quantitative guys and qualitative guys. There is an emerging mutual understanding of the beauty of various ways and the necessity of them to meet now and then in order to understand more of the extremely complexity that civic engagement development really is about.
Mm-hmm. Now, it is my impression, and this is something that I would like to ask you, that with all the social changes and mobility and what we can see in terms of the dissolution of the traditional ideas, the traditional parties, there is sort of more elastic or liquid social behaviors. And I think that sort of puts a challenge to theoretical concepts that were maybe better established in the past, but also to the methodologies we use to study this kind of behaviors. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And I think particularly the latter part of your comment is very easy to relate to what I just said about the multi-method approach. And regarding the theory, I think that we have to be more critically when, instead of just traveling with the old theories that have been established on the field, like the positive youth development theory, which is a very, very dominant theory with strong qualities and have inspired beautiful studies over the years. But as we said when we started this talk, we shouldn't look upon civic engagements as something inherently good and civilized. One other thing I do believe that we have to develop theoretically is, of course, maybe more normatively. If just a few of the citizenry is active, what do we do with the ideal concepts of active citizenship, for instance? So, in center of the civic education literature and theory, for instance. So, in an indirect way, the findings in the field of political socialization also urge for a normative approach, as we were discussing before regarding the schools. What should the schools really learn? is it reasonable for the teachers to go on and preaching the value of an active citizenship, independent or disregarding of the very different conditions for active or being and becoming an active citizenship?
And I guess I would like to ask you a last question. What would you say to scientists that tends to get sort of contaminated with the popular pessimism about the current state of affairs in political systems? What is our role as a scientist in terms of trying to inform and move forward through the knowledge that we acquire with our research, move forward the growth of political systems?
I think there are more than one thing to say, but one thing is that we shouldn't be too occupied with the current situation. We shouldn't overinterpret it. We should take it seriously, but we should try to understand it in its actual and temporal and political context, and look at comparisons, so we may be more nuanced before we are alarming the public audience and so on. Another thing I think is important is that we shall remember and remind ourselves about a very fundamental thing on democracy, that democracy is and cannot ever be seen as a fixed form. It would be a tragedy. A main democratic theorist said many years ago, if our kids and grandkids just took over the same democracy as we received from our parents and grandparents. So the democracy had to be changed in order to serve new generations. So we shouldn't be more defending of the current democracy and taking the risk that we would preserve it, because it is the only one we know about. We should also make sure that we understand the sentiments in the young generation, and be informed and inform the public debate that things are happening. There is no crisis when it comes to, at least when it comes to Sweden, to the democratic beliefs or the support for democracy. But the ways in which the political parties operate and the political institutions work may call for reforms and may call for changes, so the trustworthiness can be deserved.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.